Hey guys, it's History Behind the Warrior and welcome back to another Mortal Kombat video. Now seeing as I've been talking about him a lot recently, it seemed only right that I talked about the former ruler of Outworld, the ancient Dragon King Onaga. Now to actually touch on this topic and show some ideas that the expanded timeline has in fact touched on, I'll need to go all the way back to that of the original timeline and talk about the Dawn of the Realms, as Onaga is in fact a very ancient individual that does live in the universe. Now for me to do this, let me give you a brief summary of how the realms came into existence. Now at the very dawn of time, nothing existed, it was simply an empty void. But in due time, there were two deities that came into existence, the first being elder gods, and the second being the fabled One Being. Now both were incredible deities of divine power, but the two sides didn't get along with each other, as the One Being was the apex predator, and thus killed and gorged on the remains of the elder gods. Now outmatched in power, the elder gods formulated a plan to take him apart, in the most literal sense. You see, they forged Kamidogu amulets that would separate the One Being's physical consciousness, and the physical remains of his body would somewhat evolve into the realms as we know it. So the physical plane of each realm in the Mortal Kombat universe is in fact a fraction of the One Being's body. So after a few years had passed by, these realms would flourish with life, giving birth to many different races across the Mortal Kombat universe. Now when the Elder Gods saw what the One Being's body had created, they decided to see what would become of the mortals. So they watched from a distance, but did appoint gods to look over the mortal plane and keep an eye out for the possibility of the One Being's return, which is actually why the Elder Gods do not tread on mortal soil, out of fear they may awaken the One Being. Now that being said, and the realms coming into existence, one of the first and strongest races to be born were the dragons. Ancient and powerful, they were perceived by many to be descendants of the gods themselves, as physically there were a lot of traits that they did share when an elder god is in its true form. So because of this, they were held up in very high regard. Not only were they extremely strong, many of them aligned themselves with the gods. Two examples are in fact Orin and Karo, both being aligned with the Edenian god Argus, as they were assigned the mission of awakening Taven and Dagon during the events of Armageddon, so it does allow them to be seen as emissaries of the gods. But Onaga was quite different in that respect. You see, unlike his brothers and sisters who would leave their home of Outworld, Onaga decided to stay behind, wanting to hone his powers and abilities so that he could rule these lands. And this was a mission he was successful in. Onaga became the ruler of Outworld, and he was seen as a threat by many. You see, whilst honing his skills, Onaga didn't just learn how to manipulate his magical properties, but he in fact descended into what would be known as the Dark Arts. As it seemed like in the Mortal Kombat canon, Onaga was one of the first individuals to ever learn about necromancy, which would become a key part of his role and his legacy. Now one thing that I do wish to point out that I haven't elaborated on is Onaga's title as seemingly the Dragon King. Now unfortunately, due to how scarce dragons are in the Mortal Kombat series, we don't actually know if Onaga is king of the dragons or an individual who called himself king because he ruled the land of Outworld. So we do not know how true the Dragon King title is, but with his powers and capabilities, it was certainly a mantle and title he earned. Now upon forming his great empire, there were many that set his eyes on him. Becoming said ruler of Outworld naturally put him in the crosshairs of many. So in order to combat outside threats, Onaga would form the Unstoppable Army. Now on the surface, this was an army like any other, consisting of disciplined and well-trained soldiers that would fight and die in his name, and that is something they certainly did, not that it stopped them from serving under him. You see, going back on what I mentioned about necromancy, whenever Onaga was in combat and one of his soldiers would fall, he would use his talents in necromancy to instantly resurrect whoever fell, thus giving off the impression that Onaga had an immortal army, one that would serve every single order he dished out, and one that would not fall in combat. So when Onaga took the reins of becoming Outworld's ruler, he never lost a single battle, and because of the devastation he laid out across the realm, asserting his dominance and becoming its rightful ruler, it did in fact put him in the crosshairs of the Elder Gods, as they were worried about his power, and that he himself may in fact be a vessel for the One Being's return. But they couldn't be more wrong. You see, one interesting fact about Onaga is that he was seemingly so strong that he mentally and subconsciously fought off the One Being's influence. You see, the One Being at this point in time was physically dead, but with the life sprung from his body, he attempted to use those vessels as a way to return, and Onaga was in fact the perfect candidate. But it seems like Onaga's fortitude surpassed what the One Being had expected, as typically when individuals are tainted by the One Being's influence, they wish to merge the realms together, thus by by doing so they are able to become him. But this was something Onaga wasn't at all interested in, instead being interested in something far more valuable to him: immortality. You see, whilst Onaga was an almighty ruler, even he knew and understood that he still could die, and this is something he didn't want, as understandably he fought for his title as ruler of Outworld and wished to remain in this position, despite his advisor Shao Kahn being against this, and believing that the only true way to obtain immortality was by merging the realms together. So from what you can tell, the One Being's influence had passed from Onaga to Shao Kahn. Now, in order to obtain immortality, the Dragon King theorized that the only way to obtain immortality was to somewhat be baptized in the blood of a dragon egg, and as dragons were very rare, he believed that the blood of a youngling and an innocent would allow him to surpass the mortal plane. But before he could pursue his dream, Onaga was poisoned by Shao Kahn, killing the Dragon King and ending his reign. You see, Shao was quite smart in this approach, believing that one-on-one combat could lead to his demise. Shao and the One Being's influence wanted to remove Onaga so the merging of realms could begin, and with an immortal army at his fingertips, it seemed like Shao could actually achieve this. But sadly, this wasn't a plan he thought through. Upon Onaga's demise, his immortal undead army would also go into a deep slumber, and while Shao was extremely proficient in the dark arts, the immortal army did not heed his call, and thus he was forced to make an entirely new army made up of the different races of Outworld. Now, whilst Onaga was physically dead, much like the One Being, his consciousness would continue to live on, inhabiting individuals so that he himself could plan for his own return. Now, here are where things get rather twisted and interesting. Due to Onaga's demise at the hands of Shao Kahn in his weakened state, whilst planning for his return, it seems like now Onaga was susceptible to the One Being's corruption, as his plan of immortality later would evolve into one that would merge the realms through Kami Dogus. So it does seem like whilst Onaga was almighty in life, in death even he couldn't escape the One Being's corruption, and thus this brings us onto the conquest mode of Mortal Kombat Deception. Now, Mortal Kombat Deception's story does in fact take place before the events of Mortal Kombat 1, and somewhat interweaves between each of the main installments, up to the ending of Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. Now, the plan for Onaga's return is set in motion before the very first game, where he's in pursuit of finding a true believer to fall into doing his bidding. So whilst exploring Outworld, he came across a young man by the name of Shigenko, strong, poised, and very much so determined. The Dragon King would reach out to him under the persona of Damashi. Now, in this disguise, Damashi proclaimed himself as a messenger of the Elder Gods, and thus wished to test the faith of mortals. So when he reached out to Shigenko and told him that he was chosen for a divine mission by the gods, the young and naive man would accept it, and thus carry out Onaga's bidding of obtaining the Kami Dogus of each different realm. So over the next few decades, whilst under his Damashi persona, Onaga had him retrieve each of the Kami Dogus from different realms, more or less guaranteeing his ability to merge the realms. Now, as Shigenko was doing his bidding, Onaga himself had to find a way to obtain a new body, and this is where the long lost dragon egg that he found comes into play. He would house his own physical being within the egg and bind his time, wanting a suitable host that could embody his dragon-like traits. So this is where Reptile comes into the mix. As you see, the Saurian was currently working with Nitara, wanting to find a way to save his former realm and restore his people, but unfortunately for Reptile, when he stumbled into Outworld's lava shrine, he came into contact with the dragon egg that Onaga was housed in, and thus when Onaga saw the Saurian, he would project his physical being onto him, with Reptile being the returning vessel for Onaga's rebirth. So unfortunately, much against the Saurian's will, Onaga would proceed with his own plans, pushing Reptile into the back of his psyche as he took over his body. Now reborn, and aware of the current state of the world, with Shao Kahn out the picture and Liu Kang dead, he knew that this was the perfect opportunity to take some big players off the board, starting with the Deadly Alliance. After Liu Kang was slain by the pair, Raiden assembled the Earthrealm Defenders in order to storm their stronghold and take down the duo. However, they underestimated their power and were all defeated and killed, with Raiden being the very last to fall. But before they could bask in their victory, the tension between the two sorcerers finally exploded, and the pair turned against each other. But upon Quan Chi's victory, Onaga would finally make his presence be known, appearing within the stronghold and have his immortal army bow down before him. Onaga had finally returned. Not only that, but he would defeat the trio of Shang Tsung, Quan Chi, and Raiden, with even the Thunder God sacrificing his own life in the hopes of destroying him. But his sacrifice was in vain, as Onaga emerged emerged victorious, with Shinnok's amulets now in his possession. From here, he would resurrect the Earthrealm Defenders and put them under his rule, as well as finally reveal his true identity to Shujinko, and how it was him who brought on the end of days. So Onaga's plans were finally set in motion, and he was on the brink of victory, but his overconfidence had gotten the better of him. As you see, whilst he had victory at his fingertips, he had underestimated the other fighters of the realms, as well as Shujinko himself. Having joined forces with Ermac, Nightwolf, and the spirit of Liu Kang, they were able to not only storm the stronghold, but Shujinko was able to channel every fighter's power into one single punch that would put down Onaga, and like that, the Dragon King was defeated. But being aware that he would not stop here, Nightwolf took Onaga to the Netherrealm and bound his soul to the realm with an ancient Native American ritual known as the Sin Eater. But this spell would be undone in the next installment, Mortal Kombat Armageddon. Now, between the events of Deception and Armageddon, Onaga would be approached by Shinnok and offered him a deal: stay here and rot in the Netherrealm, or join him in the Battle of Armageddon, secure his victory, and in turn Onaga could take Outworld's throne. So with no other choice at hand, he would accept Shinnok's offer, but would formulate his own plan once he was released. Onaga was completely unaware about the Battle of Armageddon and the power that blazed hell, but once he learned of the details from Shinnok, he knew that he wanted this power for himself, believing that it would give him power that would have rivaled that of the Kamidogu. From here, Onaga does make a very brief cameo in the Conquest mode, where he is seen forming an alliance with Shao Kahn and the Deadly Alliance, as they understandably are all interested in Blazer's power, and whilst they do cooperate with each other, there is no honor amongst thieves. So once the Battle of Armageddon begins, all bets are off the table and the alliance falls apart. And once Onaga sets his eyes on Shao Kahn, he goes after his former advisor, still understandably quite bitter about his treachery. So the Emperor is carried off by the Dragon King, and that is in fact the last time we do see Onaga properly. Although we do not know the finer details, Shao Kahn was somehow able to escape his grasp, return back to the Pyramid of Argus, and absorb the power of the fire elemental Blaze, and basically become the One Being, in turn bringing an end to the conflict, as well as the realm. But as we do know, this isn't the end of the original continuity, as just before Raiden is killed, he sends a message to his past self in order to prevent any of this from going on. So we don't actually know the true fate of Onaga in the original timeline, and whether or not he was actually killed by Shao Kahn. That entire fight is left open-ended, so we will never truly know, only that Shao Kahn was able to walk away. So this brings us up to our reboot in the series, and unfortunately where the Dragon King is absent. You see, the only appearance that Onaga ever does really make, at least in the main canon, is in a flashback sequence that ties Armageddon to the very first tournament, so the start of MK9. From there, Onaga does not appear in the rebooted continuity at all, instead making very brief cameos and name drops in arcade ladder endings and intros. However, there are some tidbits of information that has emerged from the rebooted timeline that tells us a little bit about what happened to this incarnation of Onaga. Now, in some verbal exchanges and intros, it is implied that once Shao obtained the title of Khan, not only did he become the new ruler of Outworld, but he inherited a fraction of Onaga's power. This may in fact be a soft retcon of Shao's visual design in Mortal Kombat 9, as Shao in Mortal Kombat 11 shares a lot of features with a dragon, so it could be believed he not only absorbed Onaga's power, but some of his physical traits. Now, Onaga was in fact scheduled to make a comeback in the Mortal Kombat X comic book series, as during the first saga, Prince Goro would lose his arms to Kotal Khan and would seek out a solution by forming an alliance with the Red Dragon Crime Syndicate, as they did worship Onaga. You see, in the rebooted comic book series, Goro was in fact the individual set up to become the new host for the Dragon King, but unfortunately the comic book series would not get a season 2, so this plotline and idea would be dropped. I do have a video with the writer explaining the original plotline and idea for Onaga's return. I have a link for it down in the description below, so please do click on that if you do wish to know of Onaga's fate. Now, to further expand on some ideas that were incorporated in Mortal Kombat 11, they do in fact tease at the idea that Liu Kang could possibly be a long-lost blood descendant of Onaga. In intros between Baraka and Cetrion, Liu Kang describes how his fighting style is in fact based off that of a dragon, and the elder goddess Cetrion even reveals that he does have ties to the Dragon King, something which he understandably does deny. And although we should take intros with a pinch of salt, a lot of them came to fruition for Mortal Kombat Aftermath, so take that for what you will, but I think it's a pretty interesting idea of how things could in fact come full circle, with Onaga being killed killed by Shao Kahn, and a long-lost descendant of the Dragon King, having been the one to defeat Shao Kahn and end his reign. It adds an interesting dynamic to the universe, and a little bit of interesting lore to Liu Kang, as there's always been a ton of references, with Liu Kang of course channeling the fire of a dragon. But that is it for the history of Onaga, with the universe being reset at the end of Mortal Kombat 11, and future installments possibly being set in the past. This may give NRS the opportunity to somewhat rewrite the timeline, and allow Onaga to come to the forefront, as we know that Mortal Kombat is being engaged with Earthrealm, where Liu Kang's offering to teach the great Kung Lao. So we must wait and see, as the future is unwritten. But for now, that is it for this video. Now what are your thoughts on Onaga? Would you like to see him return? Would you have liked to see the ideas that were set in place for the comic books to have come to fruition? Please do comment down below, as I am intrigued to hear what you all have to say. But yeah guys, that's it for now. So before this video wraps up, if possible, let's try getting it to about 500 likes, and also please do not forget to tick that bell, as it will keep you up to date with all content coming out in the future. So now, as always, please comment, like, subscribe, and share this video with everyone you know. Please take care, and I'll see you all next time.